sur, au fond, les représentations qu'on se fait du territoire aujourd'hui et de ses évolutions, à la lumière du rôle que joue en particulier un certain nombre de facteurs, secteurs économiques dont les évolutions vont changer des choses, sans doute, ont déjà beaucoup changé de choses. Et je suis vraiment particulièrement heureux de recevoir aujourd'hui, pour lancer ce cycle, c'est la première conférence aujourd'hui, Carolyn Steel, qui est une architecte qui nous vient de Londres. Elle me disait dans le métro qu'elle est une londonienne absolue, qu'elle est née là et qu'elle a fait l'essentiel pour l'instant de sa carrière là-bas. Elle a étudié l'architecture à Cambridge, où elle a enseigné ensuite plusieurs années. Elle a plus récemment enseigné aussi à la London School of Economics à Londres. Mais si elle vient ce soir ici, elle est reçue dans beaucoup d'autres pays pour cette même raison aujourd'hui. C'est à cause d'un livre qu'elle a publié en 2008 qui s'appelle Hungry City, How Food Shapes Our Lives. Donc, comment la nourriture façonne nos vies et les territoires dans lesquels nous vivons aujourd'hui. C'est un livre absolument essentiel dans lequel elle nous rappelle que la nourriture a toujours été regardée avec attention pendant longtemps, y compris par les architectes, et y compris dans les utopies architecturales comme le Garden City ou comme Broadacre City, etc. La question de la nourriture était centrale dans la façon pour les architectes d'envisager le monde de demain. Ce n'est plus tellement le cas aujourd'hui, et la question de Carolyn Steel, c'est un peu pourquoi. Pourquoi n'est-ce pas le cas alors que la nourriture joue manifestement, depuis sa production, elle vous l'expliquera elle-même, sa distribution, le waste, etc. Comment elle façonne littéralement nos territoires et qu'est-ce qu'on peut s'attendre à voir se produire des mutations de cette économie et de ses effets sur les territoires. Ce livre existe en anglais pour l'instant, mais dans 2 mois, les éditions Rue de l'Échiquier, qui avaient eu la bonne idée, il y a déjà 4 ans, de traduire Dennis Meadows, The Limits to Growth, vont publier la traduction française de ce livre. Je vous ferai circuler des flyers comme ça et puis des adresses qui vous permettront d'aller regarder ce bouquin. C'est un livre essentiel. Merci beaucoup, Caroline, d'avoir accepté notre invitation. Et à vous maintenant.
Thank you. Merci bien, Sébastien. Je m'excuse parce que je parle seulement en anglais, mais c'est un grand plaisir d'être ici avec tous vous aujourd'hui et maintenant en anglais. I've given the game away with the subtitle of this drawing, because actually on the train over here I was going to say to you, what do you see in this image? Do any of you know this image? Anyone stick your hand up if you know this image? Okay, oh, there's more and more people. Okay, interesting, It's a really extraordinary image. It shows a relationship that is so fundamental to us and to civilization that you would think there would be literally thousands of images like this, but actually it's the only one I know. It is, as you can see, it's Ambrogio Lorenzetti's Allegory of the Effects of Good Government, which was painted in 1338, and it actually sits on one of the walls in the Sala dei Nove, which is the big council chamber in Siena. If any of you have been to Siena, there's that incredible fan-shaped piazza and then the building at the end. It sits in that building looking out onto a landscape that looks incredibly like this. And I remember going to visit Siena when I was an architecture student, as you do, and going into this room and looking at this image and thinking, that's a nice picture of Siena, and looking at it for a bit and then wandering off. I'd completely missed the point, in other words. And it was only when I went back 25 years later and looked at it again that I got what this image is really talking about. And as I say, I've kind of given the game away, but it's sort of obvious if you actually look at it rather than looking at it with the eyes that expect to see what you already expect to see. it's about the symbiosis between the city and the country, which is fundamental to civilization. And Lorenzetti was completely right to stick the wall right down the middle, because it's an equal partnership. And of course, if you go to Siena now, you can see this landscape out of the window. It hasn't changed very much, actually. And if you look in detail, you can see what this picture is really about. It's about food, weirdly. And you can start to see detail. This is a group of people going out hunting, so they're leaving the city to go and shoot a boar or something. Here, up this long road coming from the countryside, you can see a pig walking into the city, donkeys with grain on their backs. There are people working in the fields. Of course, the entire landscape is modified to feed the city. It's full of vineyards and olive groves and so on. It's not a natural landscape at all. And in fact, if you read Henri Lefebvre's production of space, is that sort of something that some of you have come across? He talks about how the invention of perspective was actually to do with the landowners' houses radiating out in the countryside, a sort of form of the city imposing its order on the countryside, which actually then came back into the city and informed the city and led to the discovery of perspective. So it's a fantastically intricate relationship. But then through the wall, you can see, again, the same asses arriving with grain on their backs. You can see flocks of sheep wandering around, country women with baskets of eggs on their head, and so on. So a sort of subtitle for this image could be "Look after the countryside and it'll look after you," something like that. It's an extraordinarily important vision, and in fact, this moment in time is the moment when the city is being reinvented. It's coming after about 1,000 years of really not much urban activity at all in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. And there's a lot of thinking going on about what it means to live in a city, and a lot of Italian city-states saying, we've got to be self-sufficient, we've got to look after the landscape, because otherwise we won't be self-sufficient and we'll be vulnerable. It's a remarkable moment in time, and as I say, my question then is, why don't we think like this now? And it's a really interesting question. Here's one reason why. Because you don't look out of your window anymore and see the landscape that feeds you. In fact, the landscape that feeds all of us is mostly thousands of miles away. I've got an image here of Shanghai, simply because China, the urbanization of China, about which I'm sure you've all heard a vast amount, is really leading the way now in redefining how the world feeds itself. And of course, China is not self-sufficient. It's failing in what the Italian city-state rulers knew to be fundamental to the laws of good government. So, of course, China is as worried as the Sienese 9, the 9 council members that sat in that room, are about feeding itself. And its solution is to buy up chunks of land around the world, such as this soybean field in Brazil, and to do 1,000-year-long land deals so that basically it remains food secure. So there's an extraordinary landscape evolving that we don't see because, as I say, it's not out of our window, which is nevertheless shaping global economies and politics. I call it the urban paradox. Because living in cities is a sort of 5,000-year-old experiment that we're still struggling with, and there's an inherent paradox at the core of it. And the core is, we're animals, we need to eat, the food has to come from somewhere, and it comes from a place that is not the city. It comes from a place called the countryside, although, as Rem Koolhaas and others are saying, our image of what the countryside is very often doesn't reflect the reality of the food production spaces that actually feed us. And the paradox is even more interesting than that, because the bigger the city gets, the further and further away we get from our sources of sustenance. So there's just no kind of way of designing our way out of what is an inherent paradox. And it gets more interesting than that as well, because, I mean, cities are wonderful. I'm a Londoner. I was born and bred in the middle of an enormous city. And, you know, for many years, I have to kind of forgive myself, actually, for not having seen what Ambrogio Lorenzetti was really on about when I first saw it as an 18-year-old. Because I'd grown up in a world that was city-centric, and that had a city-centric view, and all the history I read was city-centric, and all the philosophy I read was. And, I mean, there's this fantastic image of Rome, of course, in the 14th, 15th century was kind of the center of the universe, as far as it was concerned. We just redesigned Rome. How easy was that? And what I love about this image is that, you know, here is the city with all of these incredibly important monuments inside it, and what do you get round the edge? You get this kind of weird blue nothingness. It's like it's floating in space. And it really epitomizes the way we tend to think. We think with sort of city-shaped telescopes on our imaginative eyes. And, you know, if you're born in a city like I was, it's perfectly, I mean, I think the first time I saw was a cow. I was about 8 years old. Probably now, there's kids growing up that will never see a cow because cows are going indoors, but that's a bit of a later story. Anyway, so we don't see, I mean, if I was Immanuel Kant, I would say that we can't see the world clearly because we see it through a distorted lens, a sort of city. Is anyone here the son or daughter of a farmer? There you go. But isn't it interesting? Did anyone here grow up really in proper countryside? With 4 out of 150. Interesting. Thank you for that. Now, the English are very soppy about animals, as you know. And what's interesting is that, I mean, there's a whole history here of what the city-centric view of the countryside actually does. It distorts our idea of what food production is and what farming is. And I love this picture. It's a view of London in the late 18th century. That's London smoking away in the distance over there. And it's obviously harvest time, so you've got people, you know, bringing in the hay and so on, bringing in the corn. What's interesting is that they've all got velvet caps on, so they're obviously very well-dressed peasants. And of course, there's a couple of people having a picnic at the same time. You know, it's a completely fantastical, distorted, nonsensical view of what the reality of country life was. But it was all the rage at the moment because, ironically, at this time, it was the height of the English agricultural revolution. People were getting incredibly excited about the fact that you could... It's all nicked from the Netherlands, by the way, because the Netherlands pioneered intensive farming. And then the Huguenots all got expelled and came to England, and they taught us how to farm, and then we kind of ran with the ideas. But anyway, things like crop rotation and feeding fodder to cattle radically transformed, and of course land enclosure. Are these terms okay? I mean, is this all making sense? Do you know what I'm talking about? Crop rotation, putting crops in putting crops in a different field each time to renew the soil. Special fodder crops for animals rather than just letting them nibble grass. And of course, land enclosure. You can see the land enclosure here, the effects of it. These fields hedged around would have been fairly new, actually, in those days. And there was incredible excitement about the fact that people were getting much more efficient about farming. And in fact, Adam Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, says that without the agricultural revolution, there would have been no industrial revolution in Britain, and we all know where that led to. There was also, interestingly, at the time, a sort of very hot smuggling operation between France and England for highly bred animals, because we were learning how to intensively breed animals to make them much more productive, and these were like state secrets, and they were being smuggled to France because the French got very interested about this too. So a whole set of things around a very radical, transformative reality being painted as a sort of pastoral fantasy. And it gets even more extreme. So out of pastoralism comes Romanticism. So we've seen maybe 150 years of people living in cities fantasizing about farms, basically. And all of a sudden, they start getting interested in non-productive nature. This is the first. This is the first time in history that people have got soppy about craggy rocks. Up till this point, people thought craggy rocks were where the devil lived, or they were just irritating because you couldn't grow food on them. And it's a very interesting moment, and it actually comes out of a sort of revulsion of what was happening to the city at that point. And in fact, if you look at the farming reality at this point, you can kind of see what it's trying to ignore. It's trying to ignore what was happening to farming at that point. Now, this is an extraordinary image from, Cincinnati, which was the first meatpacking city in the world. And there's various reasons for that, which I probably don't have time to go into. But essentially, there was a grain glut. People had too much grain, and they came up with the idea of feeding grain to animals rather than letting animals graze on grass. And that's really what the essence of meatpacking was. It was called Porkopolis because pigs actually had the freedom of the town. They were actually allowed to roam around the town. And there was a law that you had to chuck your food scraps into the middle of the road so the pigs could eat it freely. But then the poor little piggies came to a sticky end because they were walked up to the top of these 6-story high slaughterhouses, killed, and then sort of progressively processed down to the basement where all their fat and so on was rendered down into fats and things that could be used for fuel. So I've written cognitive dissonance because I think cognitive dissonance probably sums up our condition with respect not just to food, what we eat, but also to the fact that without the countryside, we can't exist. And cognitive dissonance, I don't know whether that's a phrase, do you understand that phrase? Yeah, so we know stuff in our head, but we act differently. And it's the kind of thing that happens when people are interviewed outside a supermarket in the UK, and they say, do you care about animal welfare? Oh, yes, yes, yes. You know, so would you pay more for an animal that was sort of reared outside than one that's reared in a battery cage? Yeah. And then the same people go in and they buy the battery cage, eggs or meat or whatever it is. So actually faced with a price choice, they can't help themselves. It's almost like something primal kicks in and they just go for the cheap thing. So it's a kind of cognitive dissonance writ large, if you like. Now, I've just sketched in a sort of fairly, quite at some length actually, the condition that I think, you know, we shouldn't blame ourselves for, but which we find ourselves in, which is the inhabitants of a place that presents itself falsely, I would say. The city, the image that we have of the city is not a real one. Now, what I want to do briefly is try to romp through 5,500 years of history to show you how we got here. So my first slide in this kind of how the city evolved through food sequence is of the Fertile Crescent, so called because obviously it's fertile and crescent-shaped. This was, as you probably know, the real-life Garden of Eden. It was the fertile territory that the Garden of Eden was based on. And about 10,000 years ago, when the last ice age ended and the ice was receding north, which, in fact, interestingly, is the last major climate change event that had cataclysmic effects for humans, people began to run out of their traditional foods, which were game. Basically, people were hunter-gatherers. They began to run out of large game. The population increased because the temperature was rising. They were running out of food. And a radical leap had to be made. And the radical leap was to start eating a different kind of food that nobody had thought of eating before, which was grain. And grain is a really irritating food to eat because you get these tiny little seeds and they've got a husk around them and you've got to basically sit by them while they ripen and try to make sure that no pests or animals eat them before you do. And then you've got to take them off, and you've got to pound them and get the husk off, and then you've got to mash them about and either make a kind of, well, actually for the first 3,000 or 4,000 years, they just made a kind of nasty porridge out of it, with a lot of hard bits in, all their teeth fell out. It was not I mean, in fact, farming's a really bad idea. It's a really bad way of feeding ourselves. But it was a radical leap that led to consequences that I think all of us would appreciate, because it was the leap that made it possible to have settled communities, because grain is the only food we've ever discovered that can produce a large surplus and a relatively predictable surplus, which means that not everybody has to spend all their time running around after food, and they can actually just camp in one place, as they did, you know, in these early semi-agricultural communities along the east coast of the Mediterranean, and then eventually found a group of settlements that were the first cities on Earth. So the reason farming is radically different to hunting and gathering is that it's static. You know, basically your food is there, and you have to stick around and protect it. You don't follow your antelope or your boars or, you know, the ripe berries around a larger territory. So grain is the food of cities, basically. It always has been, and for the foreseeable, it will be. And there's interesting things to say about that as well. So what were these earliest farming communities that evolved into cities like? Well, here's one of them, This is from a map of the city, roughly 2000 BC. You notice several things immediately. You notice it's extremely small. That's about 500 meters across. Not very big at all. Very dense, so that's the excavated part of the residential area. So tiny little mud huts with hardly any space between. Obviously on a whacking great river, the Euphrates in this case, and surrounded by farmland. And in the center, a temple. And what's really interesting about the temple is if you look at it closely, you see that this building is an enormous municipal granary. And in fact, it turns out that the temple was not only the religious and spiritual center of the city, but also the food hub, effectively. The temple organized the harvest. They brought in the grain. They offered it up to the gods in the famous ziggurat. And then they stored it in this granary and then cooked it into bread and then fed it out to the rest of the people during the course of the year. So if you were to sort of try to describe how the first cities on Earth fed themselves, you would say that they were city-states, which means like Siena, in fact, a dense core of urbanity surrounded by farmland. And they had, as I say, a large spiritualized, centralized food hub in the middle. And that really is the pattern of most ancient cities for thousands of years. And of course, there was one notable radical exception to that, and that was Rome. And I've called it City 2.0 because basically it's the complete opposite model of how to build a city. Rome had 1 million or so citizens by the 1st century AD. You can see the size of it. I mean, it's just vast. And, you know, there's the river it was founded on, but it's just splurged out into the countryside. Now, if I've just shown you how a sort of a small compact city fed itself, how do you think a city like this would have fed itself in the ancient world? Any ideas? Where do you think its food came from? Where does our food come from? Sorry? Other countries, did you say?
Yeah, from the country because it was untitled.
Exactly. It came from a very long way away, is the answer. You're absolutely right. Now, we think of food miles as a modern phenomenon because our food comes from thousands of miles away. It's not a new phenomenon. The only way a city the size of Rome could have fed itself in the ancient world is by conquering distant countries. Why? Okay, think about feeding 1 million people. They lived on bread, as a lot of us still do. Bread is made from grain. Grain weighs a lot. Imagine enough wagons drawn by oxen going along kind of bumpy roads for 1 million people's worth of bread every day. It's physically impossible. In fact, there's a very interesting study done that shows that 20 miles out of Rome, 30 kilometers, 30 kilometers out of Rome, it was economically unfeasible to bring grain into the city, and it cost the same as sailing it in from North Africa. And that's why, because it was about 50 times cheaper to take food over water than over land. That's why Rome conquered Sardinia, Sicily, Carthage, and last but not least Egypt, because it was getting its hands on the most vital thing, which was a grain supply. And in fact, Egypt became the breadbasket of Rome. The Alexandrian grain ships were the super tankers of their day. That's fine. They were the grain ships, the super tankers of their day. Rome was fed on a just-in-time basis, if you know what that is. It's absolutely the model of how we feed ourselves now, which is that we only ever have about 2 or 3 days' supply of food anywhere. Paris. I mean, if all the food to Paris was stopped, there would be food riots within 2 or 3 days. And we've seen it in the UK when there was the lorry strike. So this is not... and in fact, you can go on and on, actually, looking at the way Rome fed itself, and it's extraordinary. It's directly analogous to many of the problems that we face now. So if I tell you that, you know, the city was sucking the goodness out of the whole of the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the North Atlantic coast, it was even importing oysters from Britain at one point, oil, pork, liquamen, which is a fermented fish sauce. And you can see very quickly that not only could another city the size of Rome not have existed here, because Rome was actually dominating the hinterland, but also that, in a way, its need to continue expanding the empire was really driven by its need to find food supplies. And in fact, Augustus was said by Tacitus to have basically saved himself by conquering Egypt, because the people were so grateful that he found a food supply. So the other thing is, of course, eventually this whole thing collapsed, you know, and it just got too big. And arguably, you know, you could say that Rome ate itself to death, effectively, because towards the end, all of the land that it was farming intensively in Africa the soil became denuded, it became salinated, it lost its fertility. So there's a kind of interesting example there. Now, the first person who analysed how a city fed itself was a German called Johann von Thünen. He was a landowner and a geographer, so he was very interested in, you know, how land was used, basically. And he wrote a book called The Isolated State, which you may just about be able to make out up there. And he said, if you have a city represented by that pink blob, how, if the city was surrounded by the isolated state, which was a featureless, flat, fertile plain, inhabited only by logical, profit-seeking farmers, so it's a bit like a board game, how would the productive hinterland evolve? And what we've already seen is that if you're feeding a city, you've got two key problems. The first key problem is how to grow the stuff, and it has to be grain, ultimately. And the second problem you've got is how to get it physically into the city. Now, grain, as we've just seen, is very difficult to transport long distances. In fact, it becomes uneconomic very quickly because it's heavy. So that limits naturally the size to which the city could grow. So he said, well, obviously close to the city you'll have market gardening because fruit and vegetables are very difficult to transport. They go off very quickly. And they're high-value foods. I mean, they're luxury foods. So the farmers can sell them for a big profit and therefore afford the high land rents near the city. Then you'll have a band of about 30 kilometres of grain production, but no more, because after that it becomes uneconomic to produce it. And that, of course, limits the size to which the city can grow. If it can't get its food in, it can't grow. And then the final band is livestock production, because cattle can walk. They can provide their own transport. They might lose a lot of their weight along the way, but they can physically get themselves into the city. So they can be grown, raised hundreds of miles away. That's not a problem. But of course, they can't sustain the population. You can't grow an urban population on meat because you simply can't produce enough of it. The only concession he made to geography was to say that if the city was on a navigable river, then all of those bands could extend because the food could come in from a lot further away because it was much easier to sail it up the river. Now, have any of you been lectured about this? Does it come into your courses, in fact? Interesting. I mean, I had one lecture on this in my third year as an architecture student, and I promise you I fell asleep. I thought it was so boring. It is boring in the abstract. When you apply it to real places, it becomes completely gripping. So that's what we're going to do. Here are two cities. One's my city, one is quite close to yours. What do you immediately notice about this picture of the Seine in the 17th century and this picture of the Thames in the 19th, but actually about both in the pre-industrial era? Apart from the fact one's in colour, any key differences that immediately strike you? What about the objects in the water, the ships and the boats? What about them? Anyone? I'm going to sit here until one of you says. Yes? The same gentleman again. Yeah, that's not what I'm after, though. But thank you for trying. It took me, here's a clue. It took me about an hour and a half by train to get from the tunnel to Paris, and the train goes very, very fast. Thank you, yes?
Paris is quite a mess.
Yeah, that's true, and that is very true, and there's so much interesting to say about that, but that's not what I'm after either. One more go, somebody. What have I been talking about, how much easier it is to transport food over water and food coming from a long way away? Yes?
People seem to stay in Paris and they seem to transit on London. It's not for a long time in London and they stay in Paris for a long time.
No, okay, but thank you for trying. I'm going to tell you the answer. These are ocean-going vessels. These are river barges. These boats have come from the Baltic, they've come from Amsterdam, they're bringing in grain from all over the world. These barges have come from the local area. Paris is roughly 200 kilometers from the sea. London is on a navigable river, so ocean-going ships can come in. This completely determines the relative political histories of these two countries. It's so profound. If I show you how Paris fed itself, Paris had a thing called the Grain Police. They were thousands of officials headed up by the king, who was called the Baker of Last Resort. It was the king's duty to feed the people, and the harvest was a very uncertain thing in the pre-industrial world. 1 in 3 roughly used to fail. When the harvest failed, Paris didn't have enough grain. It had these things called provisioning rings. This was officials armed, going out into the countryside and going, "Give me your grain." Now, the countryside wanted the grain too because they just had a bad harvest, but they were forced to hand it over to the city. This was an incredibly unpopular, impossible, difficult, horrible way of feeding a city. Paris had 700,000 people living in it just before the revolution, and that's a lot of people. It couldn't do what Rome did. It couldn't just send its boats out and conquer the Mediterranean. And we all know really what happened next. I mean, as it happens, that the whole system was centralized. It was, as it were, symbolically headed up by the king. All the markets were put in one place, Les Halles. The guy that said it all looks a bit messy on the river is absolutely right. It was completely chaotic because the city was trying to control the grain supply, and you had to climb over barges to sort of do a deal, sort of 4 barges down. There wasn't enough space. It was all a total nightmare. And then it all went into Les Halles, which became a citadel of food, and actually was so powerful because it had what the city really needed, which was a place, where you could get stuff to eat. Then an Icelandic volcano went off and ruined all the harvest for about 10 years. Guess when that happened? It went off in 1780. So 9 years of failed harvests. Where's the food? Baker of last resort. Why aren't you feeding us? The baker of last resort, of course, can't do anything about it. He flees. This is Louis XVI, and famously is apprehended because he's so greedy. He won't feed his people, but he's so greedy he stops for dinner, and then he's apprehended by the city authorities and brought back, and we all know how that ends up. And this cartoon, which is one of many at the time, is called Fat Birds Fly Slowly. So fat Louis XVI was just, too greedy to escape and save his own life. Now, this is a salutary story about why politicians hate having to control the food supply. They hate telling people what to eat. They hate being responsible for it because it's an inherently impossible thing to control and highly emotive. Now, here's the other city, and I really am going to have to speed up because I'm having far too good a time. But anyway, here is the other city I showed you, London. Navigable river, lots of ocean-going vessels. There's Westminster, that's where the king is. He doesn't give a toss about the city. The city is basically allowed to get on with its own shtick. If you go back to von Thünen, just a moment ago, the slightly boring diagram, here it is applied to a real city. Corn. Grain is coming in mostly by river because it's very heavy and difficult to transport any other way. Comes into the city, 2 main river ports, Queenhithe and Billingsgate, and it's trying to make its way up to Cornhill, so called because that's where the corn exchange was, corn being the old-fashioned word for grain, basically. Bread Street, as you can see, is named because bread is being sold as the corn is travelling up into the middle of the city. Fish is obviously coming in by river as well, of course. Again, Queenhithe and Billingsgate. You may know that Billingsgate remained London's fish market until the 1980s. So if you think, this is a time when the city was, the city was really, it was all kind of Gordon Gekko, Wall Street type people on mobile phones. And you still had this smelly building with people kind of wheeling, barrels of fish around, slap bang in the middle of all of that. It's really quite extraordinary. And food does this. Food ways are incredibly long-lived because if you think about it, it's very difficult to redesign a food supply. Because you can't kind of go, well, we'll just stop doing it like this and then we'll sort of put the thing, we'll get the food in from somewhere else. And because it has to keep coming every day. So there's a reason why markets, once they're in a place, they tend to stay put. And as I say, the longevity of Billingsgate tells that story. You probably can't read it, but these streets are called things like Fish Street, Friday Street, which is where you went to buy your fish on a Friday when eating meat was forbidden. Now, of course, cows can actually swim, interestingly. That's a fact of the day. And in fact, some of London's cows did swim the first bit of the journey, the ones that were bred on very North Scottish islands, did a little bit of swimming, and then they walked hundreds of miles into the city. Most of London's meat was produced, imagine that's Wales over there and Scotland up there, a long way from the city, as von Thünen predicted. They walked in, they were fattened up in the city outskirts, and then they came into Smithfield, a smooth field outside Newgate, where they were slaughtered. And And poultry, which is where the Bank of England still is, that was so named because all the turkeys and geese were reared in East Anglia, to the north and east of the city, and they came waddling in, waddle, 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 and they were sold at the eastern end of Cheapside, London's main market. So what you can see, and you can do this with any city that was founded before the railways, you can literally trace how the city evolved through food, because you know that food had to be getting in, and you can always find streets called Bread Street, Fish Street, Milk Street, Egg Street, and so on. And it's a really interesting thing to do if you don't have to catch up on Facebook or do anything more important. Here is Smithfield Market, the one we were just looking at. This is 1830. This is pretty recent. And it's still a livestock market. And as you can see, it's pretty chaotic. There were up to 10,000 animals in Smithfield at any one time. People got trampled to death. There were 183 unlicensed slaughterhouses around the market. So the cattle were mostly slaughtered in basements. You can imagine what it was like. In fact, you don't have to imagine it. There's an amazing description of it in Oliver Twist, in Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, where Oliver goes through the market and just experiences this heaving mound of flesh. But it also tells you that if you lived in a city at this time, you actually were aware of where your food came from, because it was all visibly there. It was all kind of mooing and bleating just outside your window. So the organic nature of the city, as it were, was palpable. And that's where my very brief kind of description of how cities and food co-evolved for 5,000 or so years ends, because in the mid-19th century, this came along and everything changed. The railways, I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but they really did change everything overnight. I mean, if you look at this as the first railway ever built, it was actually built to take coal from the dock of Liverpool to the growing industrial city of Manchester. But in fact, as soon as the railway was built, people thought, oh, we could actually put passengers on this, and look, we can actually put cows on it as well. This changes everything, and I mean, it changes three fundamental things. The first is, what we've been looking at so far is that food co-evolves, it sort of exists in the city, it's visible, you see animals walking past your window. Now, food becomes invisible, because the animals are no longer walking into the city, they can be slaughtered hundreds of miles away and brought in as dead meat, which is what starts to happen. So food becomes invisible. Second thing, cities have always been limited in size by geography. They couldn't grow bigger than they could actually feed themselves. Only cities like Rome with access to the sea could grow enormous. Now they can grow as big as they like. And thirdly, politicians who'd always been forced in many cities, including Rome, to take control of the food supply, ditched it as an issue. They just thought, thank goodness we don't have to bother about any of this anymore, because these food companies are so good at feeding the city, they can do it for us. And that's why, the whole thing really is kind of goodbye to geography as far as cities are concerned. That's what happens to London. That's a map that's, about 300 years later than the one we were just looking at. It's barely grown. That's in 1840. When the railways come, look what happens in the space of just 70 or 80 years. The city turns into a sort of metropolitan splurge. And if you think about the city authorities controlling the sale of food in the markets, which is what they did, they can't control the food system anymore. They couldn't have done even if they wanted to. And of course, as the city splurges, so does the productive hinterland. So the railways not only make it possible for cities to grow bigger, but they open up enormous areas of grassland to the possibility of grain production. So this is the result of the railways coming to America, the whole of the Midwest, which used to be grassland with bison grazing it. Well, the Westerners kind of killed most of the bison, mostly for fun. But anyway, that's another story. And again, meat packing, as we saw at the beginning with Cincinnati, goes global. And the Chicago Union Stockyards, I mean, this is, you know, one of many extraordinary images of just stockyards as far as the eye can see. These are all cattle that have been raised, you know, on grain, and they're going to get slaughtered in these enormous slaughterhouses and exported all over the world. And what happens here is really interesting, because this is the beginning of meat being an urban food. So people, as I said, have always existed on bread predominantly, but when cheap meat becomes available, they start eating as much of it as they can get their chops around. But of course, they're still eating grain. They're just eating it having gone through an animal first. And it takes about 10 times as much grain to feed us if we eat it in the form of meat rather than just directly eat the grain. So it's a fantastically inefficient way of feeding us. Of course, cars follow the railways. You have a landscape that nobody in their right minds would try and walk in. You have no longer the market in the center of the city, but you have the supermarket on the outside. This is the first ever mall, Southdale in Minnesota, designed by an Austrian architect, Victor Gruen. And basically, Victor Gruen, who'd sort of come just before the Second World War and was completely perplexed by American cities. You know, where's the middle? Where do I kind of go to hang out? There's no middle. And he realized that Americans basically didn't like walking, they only liked driving. So he thought, well, I'll trick them into kind of coming to a city center, because I'll let them drive to it. And then when they get inside, they will encounter what he called eternal springtime, which is basically just, you know, birds in cages and waterfalls and lots of spending opportunities. And he discovered that they'd walk 10 times further inside a mall, because they just thought they were inside and they weren't really walking, than they would if they just went to the local high street. So, of course, we became instantly addicted to this way of shopping. And, of course, if you shop like that for food, what happens is you go to this box, and of course the food now is no longer coming into the middle of the city, and in fact we've started to get industrialized food distribution systems, which mean that the food itself has to change. It has to be able to withstand a completely large-scale, long-distance distribution network, and so it all starts to go into boxes and packages like this. And she's just gone shopping and she's just come back and she's sort of, why did I buy that? And what's that? And she's going to stick it all in that box and it's all going to go off, basically. So this is the beginning of our complete distancing from the reality of food. People in boxes, I mean, this is totally familiar now. This is how we shop. And of course, what's happened is that the city has effectively been eviscerated. So, I mean, here's a recent map from New York. That's Manhattan. And, you know, that's the rich bit of Manhattan where Woody Allen shoots all his films. That's the poor bit where all the sort of, you know, blaxploitation films of the 1970s were shot. So rich, poor. Red is a food desert, basically. Food desert is defined as a part of the city where you have to walk more than 200 meters in order to buy fresh food. And which doesn't sound like very far, but if you imagine sort of kids and shopping, and you know, it is a long way. What this tells you, this shows you what abandoning the food system to free market capitalism does. The food is no longer, as it were, going to the people, it's going to the money, where the money is. So the modern food system feeds rich people, but it doesn't feed poor people. And as I say, it's a kind of reversal of the logic of the city. If you think of the city, if you think of the very first city that we looked at, one of the first ever built, with the food hub in the middle that was, as it were, administered by God and feeding the people, it's the exact opposite. The city is emptied out of food, and the food is available in boxes on the outside. In fact, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that supermarkets are anti-urban. They literally obey a logic that is counter to what the logic of the city is. They're designed to exclude people. So the packaging on a piece of food is designed so the food can talk to the customer, and you don't actually have to speak to a salesperson, which costs a huge amount of money, because the most expensive thing in anything that we do as humans is other humans. You know this story, but here's rather a sort of mind-jogging graphic. The number of large cities with more than 1 million people in them. And as you know, China is urbanizing at an enormous rate. So this is how many million big cities we've got in Europe, and this is how many there will be by 2030 if things carry on at the rate that they are, which of course is another question. I said to you at the beginning that China is as worried as the Sienese city councillors were about feeding itself. And if you look at the scale of the problem, it's really extraordinary. This is Shanghai, as recently as 1980. All Chinese cities used to be surrounded by municipally run market gardens. So if you think of your von Thünen again, you know, that fruit and veg growing little fringe, was all fertilized with human and animal manure, as it had been in the medieval city. And I forgot to mention that with von Thünen, but I mean, another benefit of having fruit and veg growing in the city fringes is that you can take the benefit of human and animal manure, which you dump on the land, which makes it fertile. So that's what all the market gardeners used to do. And China used to do it until as recently as 1980. Now they do this. So they've got the biggest dairy farms in the world. They're actually being advised by Dutch agronomists, because the Netherlands, as I said earlier, they've always been world leaders in intensive farming. So here you have up to 100,000 cows in one enormous dairy unit with about 1 worker per 500 cows. In other words, it's a complete milk-producing machine. Chinese didn't used to drink milk. I mean, until about 20 years ago, they called Westerners milk drinkers because the sour smell of us, because we drank milk and ate cheese, repulsed them. Now they're the 4th biggest milk consumer in the world, and the same is happening with meat. In fact, the United Nations says we're sort of in the grip of a livestock revolution, which basically means that all the developing countries in the world, as they urbanize, their meat consumption is skyrocketing, as it did in Europe. The land grab I mentioned at the beginning, here's a graphic. It just shows you how much land is being bought up by certain countries, mostly Asian ones, largely China, in different parts of the world, to secure its long-term future. And some of these leases are, as I say, 1,000 years long. So highly contentious. And here are a list of some of the external costs of the industrial food system that we currently have. 20% of the land globally is degraded. About 30% of greenhouse gas emissions are associated with industrial farming. A lot of that is livestock production. About 70% of fresh water is also engaged. A lot of that's non-renewable, so that's in aquifers and rivers that are drying up. You know about the 2 billion obese. Waste levels you probably also know about. I think this is a sort of a subject that people are getting a lot more aware of. Up to 50% of the food we produce is being wasted. A third of the global grain harvest now goes to feed animals rather than humans. So if you do the maths again and think that it takes 10 times as much grain to feed us if it goes through an animal first, that gives you some idea of how wastefully we're feeding ourselves. And we're spending about 10 calories of energy for every calorie of food we consume. This is in the industrialized model of food. And there's about 1.4 million rural inhabitants leaving the countryside to go to cities every week. So there's a mass exodus from the countryside going on. And of course, the world's turning into that is the real story. I mean, I love this image. But well, I sort of love it in a horrible way, because the Western model of food is going global. And actually, when you look at what this is, not the globe, but the hamburger, it's really interesting how it evolved. I mean, everything I've been talking about so far has been, if you like, spatial and about moving materials around. But the really interesting thing about food is that it's cultural. Now, the hamburger evolved out of an unprecedented social mix. It was basically America in the 19th century, where people from all over Europe and Mexico, and I mean lots of different countries, were conglomerating. They all had their own food cultures. You know, the Poles had sausage, and the Italians had garlic, and the Hungarians had paprika, and so on. And all of these piquant special items were horrible to their next-door neighbours from different cultures. So in order to get on with each other, to Americanize their food, they took out the garlic and the paprika and the chili and so on, and instead they put in salt, sugar, and fat, which were the three flavour enhancers that nobody seemed to object to. And, of course, the one thing that was in America that everyone in Europe craved and didn't have was huge amounts of meat. And if you think about it, you know, if you eat bland food, you kind of have to eat more before you really feel satisfied, because you never really get that hit, you know. So imagine, I don't know, escargot without garlic. I mean, pointless. So you probably don't, actually, do you know, you probably do know this, maybe you don't. The French are the second big consumers of Big Macs outside America. Who eats Big Macs here? Honest? No, be honest. Yeah, amazing, isn't it? Amazing. You've got the best cuisine in the world and you eat Big Macs. Anyway, but the point about this, thank you for being honest with me. The point is that this is what I call lowest common denominator food. Nobody doesn't like it. And it's highly profitable for the people that push it, which they do relentlessly, and it's going global. The biggest expansion markets now are in China, India, you know, all the places that have the best cuisines in the world, basically. And it's a hugely damaging way to eat, not just for us, but for the planet as well. For some of the reasons, I call that my Armageddon slide. That's as bad as this lecture gets. It gets more positive after this, you may be pleased to know. But we are in a mess. We're in a real mess with the way that we feed ourselves. So this is when I begin to offer you some comfort. And the comfort is that we've always been in a mess. Is that comforting? Probably not. But it's not the first time that people have said, how are we going to keep this thing going? In fact, for as long as people have been living in cities, they've understood intuitively the urban paradox. They've always realized it's really hard to feed a city. So Plato, who of course lived in a city-state, which was Athens, said, you know, he could see the degradation of the hills, of the landscape around during his lifetime. And the Greeks, of course, were famous for limiting the size their cities grew to. When they grew too big, they just said, you, and you, get in a ship and go off somewhere else and found another city. So they understood the importance of limiting the size of the city. Thomas More, in the 16th century, he lived in London. He thought it was a horrible place. He thought it was greedy, it was too big, it was corrupt. He wrote Utopia as a kind of critique of the way London behaved. And Utopia is a really interesting place. It's fictional, of course. It's an island discovered by a Portuguese mariner who just sails up to it by accident. And it consists of a series of little city-states, which are about a day's walk from one another, and they're all self-sufficient. And of course, now that I'm food-obsessed, probably always was, but you know, now that I sort of see food in everything, if you read Utopia, it's all about food. I mean, farming is the only activity that men, women, and children all spend at least a minimum of 2 years of their lives doing, and they're all gardening obsessed. They have sort of vegetable growing competitions in their gardens and so on. It's really interesting how much about food there is in Utopia. And again, if you look at Ebenezer Howard, I mean, Sebastian mentioned it in his introduction, you know, saying, I mean, Ebenezer Howard really was worried about the spread of cities, as many utopians have been, and he's really Thomas More with railways. So he also has a series of limited-size city-states. They're only 32,000 big. That's as big as they can get. And they're linked to one another by railway. And he says, well, this way you get the best of both worlds because you have urbanity in the form of enough people living within half an hour's distance of one another that you can have things that really matter, like a decent symphony orchestra, but at the same time, everyone has actually close proximity to nature. So he calls it his city-country magnet. So actually, he's trying to recreate what the Sienese automatically had, which is why I call this the back to the city-state utopian model. You also mentioned Broadacre City. So This is the opposite idea. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright was also a city hater. In fact, he said that the only hope for mankind was to rediscover his inner agrarian. And he called cities cancers on the face of the earth, and he thought they should all be razed to the ground, which is a bit ironic, because he wasn't saying no to building the Guggenheim in New York, was he? I mean, you know, talk about cognitive dissonance, but anyway. So here's Broadacre City. I'm sure you've probably studied it, have you? Most of you? Some of you? Any of you? Hands? Oh, fingers. One of you has. No, no more. Go on, go on. Who's studied it, come across it? I'm just interested. 4. That's interesting. Okay. Oh, a bit more down there. Okay, fine. That's what I'm here for. Frank Lloyd Wright basically thought that the whole of America should be turned into a series of family farms. And all designed by him, of course. You could have a sort of series of farmhouse types that you could select. And, you know, here he is basically trying to persuade the army to let him build it. He spent the last 35 years of his life obsessed with this project. Have you got questions over there? No? No? Now, here's what happened to these two brave utopian visions. The Garden City got built. It got built in Letchworth on a 6,000-acre site, which is exactly what Ebenezer Howard said he wanted, by fantastic architects, Parker and Unwin. The only problem was that the big idea of the Garden City was incremental land reform. The idea was that the city owned the land and would basically, in perpetuity, keep it as sort of, you know, funneling the profits made from the city back into the land, and it was effectively going to be a city-state. But his backers, which included most of the large industrialists in Britain at that time, thought that was a bad idea, because basically it wouldn't make them enough profits. So instead of the most radical proposal for land reform ever proposed in the history of British landscape design, we got Suburbia with kind of rural, rustic detailing. It's the exact opposite of what he intended. Here's Broadacre City. So this is Frank Lloyd Wright's farmers, all happily in their, you know, digging up their turnips. This is how he solves the urban paradox. So the urban paradox, if you recall, is that, you know, basically, if we live, you know, in tiny little settlements, we're too far away from each other, but if we gather together, we lose contact with nature. Everyone's got a helicopter that looks like that, and they just fly about wherever they want, so problem solved. And maybe that will eventually be possible, I don't know, it doesn't seem to have happened yet, does it? I'm sure you've all heard of vertical farms. Have you all heard of vertical farms? Has anyone not heard of them? Hands up if you have heard of them. Incredible. Isn't this an incredible world that we live in? Okay, well, biggest response of the day by a country mile. Vertical farms, as most of you already know, is the idea that we're going to solve the urban paradox by putting food production back in the city. Can anyone tell me why that's not going to work? Yes? Yeah? Exactly. I mean, in short, the urban paradox, as I said at the beginning, has no real solution. If you put all the... And by the way, these things are being built. I mean, here's one in Singapore. They're incredibly... We were just talking earlier about Rem Koolhaas's essay on Singapore. Singapore is an incredibly rich, incredibly small country. And it's just desperate to find ways of increasing its land use and to be more self-sufficient. It's increased its own size by land infills by about a quarter over the last 30 years. And of course, it's got the money to build things like this. It can only build lettuces. It only makes sense to build to grow really fruit and veg. If you again think back to Thünen, the only thing that has enough added value to make it economic to grow in the city is fruit and veg. So I don't think you're going to see MVRDV's Pig City in the middle of a city anytime soon. And anyway, just in case you're still thinking she's lying, it's possible, I did a bit of maths. And I worked out that if Londoners stopped wasting food, which is a big ask, And if they stopped eating meat, which is an even bigger ask, because we are les gros beef, as you know. Okay, so 2 impossibilities already. You would still need to feed London on the basis of the NASA data of how many acres of land we need to feed ourselves. 2,000 vertical farms, 100 metres by 100 metres and 30 stories high. Where are they going to go? You can't even get permission to build a cottage in London. You know, it literally is impossible because that is what the urban paradox tells you. You cannot feed a city from the city. So vertical farming does have its uses, but it has to be scale appropriate and it has to be context appropriate. So if any of you think that vertical farming is the answer, this is why it isn't. Utopia, it's a utopian vision. Utopia is dreaming about a possible perfect world that can't exist, and in fact the word itself tells you why it's impossible, because it is a double derivation of either a good place or no place. Now, I remember when I was researching Hungry City, which is apparently an essential book, thank you, I found this really depressing, because I'd been reading about Ebenezer Howard and Thomas More and Plato, and there was so much food in utopian thought, and yet the idea that utopia couldn't exist, because of course we all want utopia to exist. And I thought, well, where do we go from here, you know? But by then, as I say, I'd spent 7 years thinking about food, and I thought, well, we could have Citopia, which basically just means food place, because actually we already live in Citopia. We just live in a really bad one designed by Carrefour and Tesco and Walmart, because we haven't seen, because we've been city-centric, we've been stuck in our little Rome-shaped glasses for the last 2,000 years. We haven't seen that food shapes our landscapes, our lives, our habits, our bodies, our brains, everything. So the great thing about Citopia is that it does exist, and the great thing about it as well is that you can make it better by thinking through food, and it really is that simple. Because food is not just an idea, it's also a physical force shaping everything that we do. So here is my dreadful graphic. I do apologize. I did this about 2 in the morning, while drunk, about 8 years ago. I thought, I need this drawing. This will do for the next lecture, and then, of course, I'll do a proper one. Yeah, right. Beware the temporary. The temporary is more permanent than the permanent. Anyway, that's just... So here is this dreadful drawing. I do apologize. But anyway, it tells what I need to tell. Farming, distribution centres or factories, a market or a supermarket, a kitchen where the stuff gets cooked, although most of it's already being cooked there, people eating, probably not at a table, they're probably munching in front of a television or, you know, on their computer, into the waste system, round it goes. It is a constant flow from the countryside, or whatever we want to call that place, to the city and back again. That's a real physical flow, like a river, and also like an economic circuit as well. It's far more complicated than that, though, because every single stage of that journey is affected by every other stage in multiple ways, some of which we're not aware of at all. Culture, preferences, beliefs, memory, you know, you name it. It's super, super complicated. So, if I don't like peas, you know, Mum stops cooking it for me, they stop stocking it because the demand goes down, the farmer stops growing it, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's all there. And this web, this food culture, is shaping the world and shaping us. And it always has done, by the way. We've co-evolved through food. So here's a more interesting, it's a bit like, you know, from the diagram to reality is always more interesting. Here's a fantastic book I really recommend if you're interested to learn more. Hungry Planet, it's called. And what it literally consists of is a survey made by a couple of New York Times journalists that went around the world interviewing families and basically saying, you know, what do you eat? And here's a week's worth of, you know, an Egyptian family's food. And there's a lot of them, you'll notice. Here's a week's worth of this American family's food, mostly in boxes, lots of pizza. They actually have pizza-shaped mouths, if you notice. They're evolving. Britain, where basically we live on chocolates, crisps, beer, and dog food. And of course, we are enthralled to them, so we just copy the sort of the highly packaged, you know, where are the vegetables? They're sort of somewhere dropped round the back. And Italy, which is, in many ways the most interesting of the lot, because Italy has an incredible food culture, still very intact, and yet under threat. And you can see, still very, very healthy, but the insidious march of the sodas in the background. And of course, as we know, Italy has the lowest birth rate of any European country now, and people are stopping cooking. So as I say, there's so much contained in these images to do with who eats with who else, what effect this has. I mean, in the book, he has surveys about how many McDonald's get eaten and what life expectancies are and who does the cooking and so on. But from these pictures, you can extrapolate to a whole load of things. You can say, okay, what kind of landscapes is that diet producing? Is it producing what I call, eating the view, which is effectively cows raised to eat grass? Cows eat grass. Can I just explain something blindingly obvious in case it's not blindingly obvious? Cows eat grass. We can't eat grass. Cows have 2 stomachs that allow them to do this. They ruminate. It's fantastic. And then we can eat the milk and the meat that comes from the cow. If a cow eats grain, it's insane. Eating grain makes cows sick. They have to be pumped full of antibiotics in order to stop them basically having a permanent stomach ache. And of course, then they become immune to antibiotics, and of course, then we become immune to antibiotics. It's an absolute disaster. So if you're going to eat meat and you're going to eat milk, let cows eat grass. If you don't let them eat grass, this is what you get. This is a CAFO, concentrated animal feeding operation. That's 160,000 cows seen from a helicopter. They're all wandering around in their own poo, eating grain, being pumped full of antibiotics. This is how 95, going on 96% of global meat is produced. So that's what the livestock revolution does. Social capital, shopping. Okay, we all shop for food. That's an incredible potential. You can either animate the city centre and go in and talk to a human, or you can go to a box somewhere and kind of So this is a group of architects. I think we care about public space. I hope we care about public space. Food has always been the greatest animator of public space. It's really what brings people out into the city, is to buy food and also, swap gossip and so on. So basically, editing out the human in the name of efficiency is destroying the city. Do we have the skills? Can we cook? Now, there's this phrase in English, knowing your onions. I don't know, is there an equivalent in French? It basically means knowing stuff, but of course it refers to cooking. So she's actually able to look at a basket of vegetables and kind of think about them. I don't know whether any of you ever saw Jamie Oliver's incredible series on school dinners in the UK, where he took a bunch of fresh vegetables into this school in Yorkshire, and he held up a leek and kind of said, "What's that?" And the kids began screaming and running out of the room. They'd just never seen a fresh vegetable before. They didn't know what it was. Honestly, it's so bad. You have no idea how bad it is in the UK. And I'm here like a kind of warning vulture, going, don't go down the road we've gone down. You know not whereof you are heading. Stick to the escargot. Or whatever you like to eat that's lovely and French. But anyway, or have a Big Mac if you must, but just know what you're doing. They don't have to be female, of course. I mean, nobody cooks in the UK anymore. Here's a very cheerful-looking man. He's boiling 200 pounds of pasta, is what he's doing with a button. So 1 in 3 meals in the UK is a ready meal. And I think we know enough about how badly we eat in the UK. Of course, there's a renaissance. Of course, there's a foodie counterwave. But it's middle and upper class. It's not what the basic food culture is. Eating. Here's an even more horrifying fact for you. Not this fact, which is that only 43% of American families eat regularly around a table anymore, but this fact that 19% of meals in America are now eaten in a car. Now, I mean, my question is, if eating together is basically how we became civilized, I mean, it is how society evolved. It's how we communicate, it's how we celebrate. It's so fundamental to us. If 1 in 5 meals is being eaten in a car, what does that say about society? What are we doing? That's just weird, isn't it? I find that really weird. You don't seem to find it that weird, but you're all very young. So, I mean, the last time I took a taxi in Chicago, the guy had a sort of enormous sloppy plate full of pasta in his lap, and he was kind of driving with one hand. Oh, it's never happened to me before. It's absolutely bizarre. I mean, there's literally philosophers going back thousands of years talking about the civilizing situation of the meal. If we don't care about that, what's more important? I find that a really interesting question. Waste, of course. Now, I mean, this is an image from the Second World War. This is a pig bin that every street had at the end. This little girl's putting in what look like rhubarb leaves, which is a bit sad because it actually says, do not put rhubarb leaves in on the small print. But, you know, she's doing her best. But, of course, waste reclamation is really hard. And, of course, we've grown up in a city that doesn't look like a circuit. It actually looks like a one-way road, you know, in and out somewhere where we don't think. So at the moment, I mean, this beautiful, delicious-looking cornucopia of food is actually from a supermarket waste bin. And as we know, supermarkets are astonishingly wasteful because they have to be fully stocked and because they think it'll put customers off if they're not, and they never have old produce on the shelves because that will also apparently put us off. And of course, it's against policy to sell it off cheap, which is what markets always did. So they just dump it, and they usually put blue food dye on it so that people can't eat it. So my question is, now, I mean, I've been talking a lot about food, but actually what I'm talking about is life. I'm talking about how food can help us to understand what matters in life. And I mean, some of the things I've shown you, they really they conform to different views of the world. You know, cows eating grass, taking time to shop in the middle of the city, sitting around a table and actually talking. You know, that's a kind of slow vision of the world. CAFOs in the name of efficiency, supermarkets in the name of efficiency, far too busy to eat because I'm dashing off to, what am I dashing off to do? I have no idea. You know, play on my game console for 6 hours is a sort of fast view. Nothing wrong with game consoles, it's just a set of priorities. And of course, you know, we assume that that's just fuddy-duddy and ridiculous, and that's just modern and wonderful. But is it? I mean, it's quite interesting, actually, in the UK, how many bankers, having made their fortune and absolutely hating their jobs, have gone back to doing this. I mean, there's been an absolute artisanal cheese revolution in the UK. I mean, you know, we used to be a nation of shopkeepers. Now, weirdly, we're a nation of cheesemakers. I mean, it's really strange. I think we've got as many as you do now. It's really odd. Anyway, but it's not odd, because actually, if you've got a market for that, that's an incredibly satisfying way of spending your time, whereas that's horrible most of the time. I'm talking about, you know, generalities here, of course. You can have an amazing job that involves, I mean, I sit at a computer all day, but I do a lot of that as well, by the way. I'm kind of obsessed with not making cheese, but, you know, growing food and cooking and, you know. One of the things also that underlies all of this, of course, is our relationship with technology. I mean, it was the discovery of fire, really, that sort of set us on our path to becoming human. Of course, the evolution of farming, as I said earlier, was really what made cities possible. Of course, mechanization takes all the pain out of that. Now that we're in the fix that we're in, it's quite interesting to look at our relationship with technology. How many of you, and I already know the answer to this, how many of you have heard of the Haber-Bosch process? Exactly, none of you. Do you know that the best estimates say that without the Haber-Bosch process, 2 out of 5 people on the planet wouldn't be here? Do you want to know what it does? It artificially fixes nitrogen. Nitrogen is one of the key nutrients for plants. but it's very scarce in nature. The only two ways that nature produces nitrogen that plants can actually use is actually the plants themselves, which is legumes, which is why planting clover on the ground actually takes nitrogen out into the soil, and of course the cows love it, as in a cow in clover. And the other is lightning strikes. So when there's a lightning strike, airborne nitrogen gets solidified and goes into the ground. What the Haber-Bosch process does is it artificially reproduces lightning. So it creates nitrogen in a form that can then be used in nitrogenous fertilizers, which is the basis of chemical farming. So as I say, the best estimates are that that has effectively meant that the human population has been able to pretty much double in the last century because of the huge amount of food available from this. There are enormous problems with it, however, because if you bombard soil with NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which are the three key elements of plant nutrition, it's like existing on only Big Macs for all of your life. The soil dies eventually. It loses its vibrancy. It loses all its micronutrients. It becomes a kind of a chemical factory and eventually loses its fertility, which in fact is what Justus Liebig, the inventor of so-called of chemical fertilizers, discovered in his lifetime. And towards the end of his life, he said, "I've been interfering in the work of God." I mean, he really repented. GM, you know about as much about as I do. You know, it's one of these difficult philosophical debates. But basically, it's to do with what I've been talking about up to this point. It's not to do with how we... Sorry, can I just ask you to stop whispering? Hello, it's quite distracting. Sorry, later. Or do ask me a question if you have one. Basically, it's the question of how we want to live. As I say, you know, the UN keeps saying that we have to double food production by 2050 because there's going to be 9 billion of us and we're all going to be living in cities and so on. That's one view. The other view is saying, well, currently we're wasting half the food we produce. How about if we started there? We're eating too much food. I mean, eating too much food is a form of waste. How about if we started there? There's cultural approaches to this problem. It doesn't have to be techno-fix. And if I show you this last one, have any of you seen this incredible video online of the unveiling of the Google burger? Yeah? I mean, extraordinary, isn't it? So they're using fetal bovine serum to grow meat in a lab, effectively. I mean, a very lovely guy, Mark Post, in the Netherlands, is leading this. But it's funded by Google. Can I just leave that idea with you? Do you really want the same people who are taking over your access to information to own your means of food production? I personally would kind of prefer it, if not. But this is the end game of that thing I was saying about politicians hating to control the food supply. If you don't make it a political issue, it becomes a commercial issue. So that's my problem with this kind of thinking. I think techno-fixes is a sort of the search for the silver bullet, and it will never be the answer. I love this film. Do you know this film? Incredible film. Now, my question is, what kind of a good life are we heading towards? I think this is the end game of the current paradigm. And basically, we know we're all getting too fat. It's this kind of drip feed of, I mean, in America, literally, you now get scuffles if people are sort of prevented from going into museums and stuff without their tub of cola that they kind of have to walk around, you know, in a backpack or hugging or something. Staring at a screen, too fat to move. It is actually where the current paradigm leads. And it's to do with an obsession with comfort and to do with a sort of cognitive dissonance and an outsourcing of what it actually takes to sustain us. And I personally don't find it very attractive. And then if you try to look at the invisible structures that determine our lives, and this is where it gets very interesting as well. Again, now my own creaky graphics. If someone could sort of just donate themselves to me and produce beautiful graphics for me, I'd be very, very grateful. But essentially, this is a representation of the food system that we've currently got. So at the bottom, you've got, you know, the roots of a sort of tree-like structure. This was actually based on a study done of 6 European countries, done about the year 2000 by a Dutch agronomist. 3 million farmers, about 160 million consumers, and the relationship was controlled across 110 supermarket buying desks. So that shows you graphically how powerful the supermarkets are, because most of them are so big that they can only deal with 2 or 3 suppliers, and they get to determine, our relationship with the people producing our food. Now, if you believe, as I do, that food systems and societies mirror one another, that in fact they're completely inseparable, you will fairly quickly see that that's not a very satisfactory diagram. And in fact, there's a very interesting essay written in 1965 by Christopher Alexander called A City is Not a Tree, which is a kind of critique of modern city design where everything is kind of in boxes, and I live here, and then I travel to work, and then I travel to culture, and then I travel home again. And he said cities just aren't like that. They're actually much more complicated, interwoven sets of relationships, and we have to sort of design for that. So if you want a democratic society, which I imagine most of us do in this room, you have to have a democratic food system. And that means joining the ends up. It's very difficult to get rid of that, as I said, because food systems, basically once established, are very hard to shift, but you can thin its power by joining up the ends. That's essentially what the new food movement is about. And I think the most interesting sort of expression of it is, I'm sure most of you, or many of you, know of Carlo Petrini, do you? Who's heard of him? Hands up again. Oh, okay, wrong on that one. Nobody knows who he is. Have you heard of the slow food movement? Hands up? Oh, yeah, okay, so quite a lot of you. So he founded the slow food movement, and actually it was in response to McDonald's coming to the Piazza di Spagna in Rome. And he said, we don't need your fast food, we already have our fast food. And he stood there handing out pasta. And he's always been a sort of advocate of, basically seeing what you've already got and something about understanding the real value of food. And he says we have to co-produce our food. We can't just be, the Wall-E blobs kind of just, summoning our food from nowhere and not thinking about it. We have to be conscious, and we have to meet the farmers halfway. And the new food movement is really a sort of a global movement now where people are trying to do just that. So a community-supported agriculture farm, CSA, is a farm where city dwellers pay the farmer in advance, so they fund him, and then they get their food back during the course of the year. It's a kind of completely new economic model, and quite often they go onto the farm and actually work with him because it's quite fun. Food co-ops, like this one in Brooklyn that's been going since the 70s, set up by a couple of hippies who didn't like the food system and the way it was going. It's now got 20,000 members. You basically do 4 hours a week there a month, in exchange for incredibly reasonable food that's all bought and sourced locally from within 100 miles, which in America is local, of New York, with long-term arrangements, so the farmers basically get a much better deal. This Gruppi di Acquisto Solidale in Italy, which is basically families getting together in a regional area and working with farmers that they sort of have personal relationships with, and Futsal teams in Belgium, which is a similar thing, where they actually have drop-offs in people's garages and stuff. So many, many attempts to sort of, and there are many, many of these kind of examples, hundreds, thousands of projects like that. Part of the problem, as I say, is that food is invisible. It's become invisible. We just walk into a supermarket, there it is. We have a city-centric view. We don't think about where it comes from. I'm generalizing. I'm sure there are people in this room that think about it very much. Actually, just out of interest, how many of you cook regularly from scratch for yourselves? Hands up, proudly. Okay, not many. Thank you. But that in England there'd be less. By the way, don't feel bad. We don't see the true value of food. We don't understand its relationship, to our bodies or to the planet. The only time we really see food for what it is when there's a crisis. So the Second World War, this is, obviously Kensington Gardens in the middle of London being dug up. The fall of the Soviet Union, when Havana was abandoned and it had an extraordinary revolution in organic farming. Detroit in 2010, when sorry, 2010 is just when that photograph was taken, but you know, the problem started, as I'm sure you know, when all the motor companies that the whole city had been based on all moved out, mass unemployment. The very next thing that happened is that all the national supermarket chains left the city. As I say, the industrial food systems are profit-making companies. They're not altruistic social systems. And so there's been a huge, again, sort of urban farming revolution in Detroit, and projects like Grown in Detroit, where people deliberately buy food that's been grown in the city in order to sort of support the city. Of course, it's fruit and vegetables, again, as I said, it's not grain. As I say, I don't think there's a sort of, I mean, I think urban food growing is a very, very important part of re-engaging with food. I'm absolutely for it. I'm not against it. I'm just saying we can't feed the whole city from inside itself. What we can do, and what is amazing when it happens, is things like this. This is Brooklyn Grange Farm in New York City. It's the first planning consent that was given to turn an industrial building back to agricultural. It's on top of an enormous warehouse in the old Navy district of Brooklyn. He's amazing, Ben Flanner. He now serves all the best restaurants in New York, 20 farmers markets or something. And he also has stalls up there, and of course he educates people, and this is the real thing. Incredible Edible Todmorden, which is a Yorkshire town in England where they've got this, I mean, basically it's like guerrilla gardening on an enormous scale, if you've heard of guerrilla gardening. And I call it community urban farming, because I think that's the true value of urban farming, is not that it solves the problem of how to feed the city, but that it re-educates us about the joy of growing food and just makes us aware again that food doesn't come from nowhere magically, but it actually is really, really important and difficult to grow. We can rebalance the urban-rural divide. We can do it in many, many ways. This is agroforestry, which is basically combining industrial systems with forests, essentially. And again, you start to get natural synergies between the trees and the crops, and it becomes self-fertilizing, and you have windbreaks, which help the crops to grow, all sorts of win-win synergetic benefits. Microfinancing, I mean, again, I haven't talked very much about what's happening in the developing world in terms of farmers, but of course, half the world is still rural, and half the rural world is still farming. Actually stabilizing this insane, in my view, rush to the cities where very often there's high unemployment. And I mean, the story in China is extraordinary. There's an amazing documentary called The Fastest Changing Village in the World, which charts the evolution of one farming village into a city of 1 million people over the course of 7 years. And it's brutal, and I think, as I say, the idea that urban is just simply better discounts a new way of thinking about what a good rural life could be. So it's a kind of question of rethinking that. Distribution systems, they don't have to be impersonal, inhuman, vast, warehousey type things. They can be this is the Mumbai tiffin wallahs. Basically, something like 20,000 of these guys deliver home-cooked meals from wives outside the city to husbands inside the city. And Forbes magazine said it was the most efficient delivery service of anywhere in the world, because I think out of something like 7 million deliveries, only one had gone wrong. I don't know what happened to that, but anyway. Of course, connectivity. When Ebenezer Howard was designing his city-country magnet, there weren't mobile phones. And mobile phones, of course, are transforming life in the countryside. They're making it possible for farmers to have access to information, to markets, to collaborate, and so on. So changes are afoot, and we could be thinking more about those. Food planning is now a fast-evolving discipline. It involves understanding how food shapes our lives and actually trying to do something about it as designers. So there's many aspects of it. Here's one. This is basically looking at the quote-unquote regional food shed of a city, in this case New York, and sort of saying, what is the productive capacity of this area of land? How can we actually make it more possible for more food to be grown in that area? And how, of course, can we educate people in the city to want to eat that food? So it kind of goes both ways. Embedding food in city government. Toronto just celebrated 20 years of its food policy unit inside the city council, the first of its kind in the world. Food hubs, places where food, rather than going through the supermarket chain, can actually be collected locally and then distributed in a much more humanized, localized way. Critical infrastructure such as abattoirs, because of course you can't have small-scale artisanal production if you can't slaughter the animals humanely. This is a family-run abattoir somewhere here in upstate New York that farmers from more than 200 miles will travel to, because it's the only place that, having raised their animals in the way they feel is right, they have to be killed right, and this is the only abattoir that they trust. So these things are vital. Of course, most of them have closed down. Farmers markets are obvious. I don't have to tell you about that. Patchwork farms is the idea that, yes, we can grow food in cities, but it's not a sort of a big utopian solution. It's actually making use of lots of different methods, lots of different models, lots of different spaces. And here are two interesting projects that I would call Citopian. One by Rem Koolhaas, which is still sort of on the drawing board, as it were, but it's a major food hub that he's proposing for West Louisville in Kentucky, which again would be a lot of the things I'm talking about in one place: food growing, markets, places for farmers to come, a sort of intermediary between the farmer and the consumer. And Almere Oosterwold of MVRDV, which is a very rapidly expanding new city just east of Amsterdam, where there's a radical new kind of planning approach, and essentially they're saying, have as much land as you want and put anything on it that you want, but we're going to kind of curate the process so that we have a sort of mixed-use city with some residential, some office, and some agricultural land. So it is kind of starting to come out in the wash. People are starting to think about food, but there's still a very, very long way to go. I hope that in the last, no idea, probably quite a long time, but thank you for being such an amazing audience and so attentive. What I want to leave you with is this. It's simply that food is an incredibly powerful lens through which to see the world and through which to understand, you know, what matters in society, what a good life is, and how, as designers and architects, we can actually shape the world better through this thing that we all need every day in our lives, which is food. So I hope that, you know, we can make a better Citopia together. And just eating differently does it, of course. This is the thing. Just changing what you have for breakfast actually makes a physical difference. Anyway, thank you very, very much for listening so well. Thank you very much.